One thing that can make a game last forever is the modding community that surrounds it. Take The Binding of Isaac. While the base game is jam-packed with items, levels, and bosses, enough that it would take hours upon hours in order to unlock everything in it, the community that formed is passionate enough to create additions that fit right in. One mod is Fiend Folio, a gigantic mod that adds new bosses, enemies, and playable characters to the game. Tonally, it fits in pretty well with regular Isaac. Mostly. Compared to the base game, Fiend Folio isn't afraid to slip in a little nightmare fuel. The best example I can give you is watching a video of the enemies added to the basement, and then the ones they added for the depths. It's quite a difference. And yet there's one boss that the devs created that's perfectly unique to not just the Binding of Isaac, but to the Binding of Isaac's modding community too. I want to introduce you all to Cacophobia. Cacophobia is an intense fear of ugliness, both in the person afflicted with this fear, or in the person seeing ugliness around them. And what might be ugly to one person suffering from cacophobia might be normal or even beautiful to someone else. If we apply that perception to this boss, it's essentially showing how living with this disorder would feel, especially if you feared that you were perceived as ugly by those around you. So before we discuss this fight and all the spoilers that it includes, I highly suggest you go and watch the fight. It's in the description along with the timestamps, so go and enjoy. Alright, welcome back. And you see what I mean now, right? I'm sure you noticed several unique things about Cacophobia, especially if you've seen prior bosses from the Binding of Isaac. And I think the most easily unsettling thing about this fight is that Venus, the figurehead for Cacophobia, never fights you. Instead, as you fight her, she becomes more and more battered, with every single change leaving her better or worse off than before. I guess. I mean, if you go from having your skull crushed in to missing limbs but otherwise being okay, that's better, right? The only thing that does attack you are the eyes, listed in the Fiend Folio wiki as Cacophobia's eyes, and the fact that they're the only hostile entity that actually shares the boss's name is interesting, to say the least. If all we see of Cacophobia is its eyes, where's the rest of them? This is getting into game theory territory, but I can only theorize that it has the power to control everything in the room, from multiplying or reducing its eyes, along with torturing and mutilating Venus off-screen, and maybe even keeping her from moving around. If my speculation is true, then this straight up becomes an eldritch horror story. Another thing I want to note is how rapidly the transitions increase alongside the damage you do to Venus. It also seems to intensify the damage done as well. At the start, the only damage we see is the blood staining her bandages, but then she gets her head crushed, limbs go missing, she gets cut in half, and worse. And while this can make you reluctant to continue the fight, in the end you have no choice but to. It adds a layer of tragedy to this. Not only is Venus a victim of cacophobia, but Isaac, a young boy who stumbled in on this situation, has to become complicit in her torture in order to save himself. Speaking of, the ending of the fight is very interesting. To continue its theme of breaking expectations set up by the base game, instead of Venus shaking before exploding into blood and gore, we instead get transported to a field of flowers. It's red-tinted and eerily quiet, but it's also safe. Nothing attacks you, and after a moment, you get returned to the boss room, safe and sound. And Venus is gone without a trace. It's a great way to finish the fight, but it also leaves more questions that need answers. And while that's the fight, I also have several fun facts to share. facts that only intensify how creepy and awesome this boss is. First, there's a chance of a knocking sound playing when Venus is at 20% health, which, if you're playing alone, then... Oh, sorry. Let me go get that. Oh, there's no one... Oh. Okay then. So, second, the boss music changes multiple times. It goes from the Fiend Folio boss track to an ambient drone that intensifies and changes as you deal more damage, and when Venus is on low health, 4 tracks will randomly play with each switch. Now that would be interesting enough, but they've been given titles that fit in with the cryptic nature of this fight. In order, it's a thread holds on to me, just a single pull, you can unravel all of me. Given that Venus is covered in bandages and the entire fight is spent unraveling her in a way, does this imply that she wants Issac to fight her? Maybe in order to free herself, she has to be completely unraveled, so to speak. As for the next fun fact, the thematic design of this fight was inspired by the artist Francis Bacon, who created grotesque and haunting paintings based on the tumultuous life he lived. Another artist who directly inspired one of the poses is Austin Osman Spare, specifically his one drawing called The Death Posture. In general, his work seemed to tie into more monstrous and carnal themes, and he also wrote a few occult grimoires as well. Neat. Next, if the player dies to Cacophobia, instead of the usual last will, and for those who don't know, the end screen for each failed run is a letter where Issac leaves all the things we collected over the game to his cat Guppy, while also insulting the monster that killed him. Except here, there's a drawing of a Rorschach test. The test also appears in the bestiary icon for Cacophobia, which makes me wonder, and I'm getting into theorizing territory here, but is any of the fight even real? If Issac could only scrawl a blob on the paper, then he clearly isn't seeing what we see, or vice versa. Maybe instead, to some degree, he realizes what the fight represents. Or maybe this whole fight is a look into Isaac's mental state. Rorschach tests were used in therapy to judge how a patient perceives the world. Maybe this fight isn't even real and is something that Issac is trying to process in therapy, because in the game, through getting every ending, we steadily come to realize that Issac doesn't have the best life at home. His parents went from having a loving marriage to dealing with instability on both sides. The father lost all of their savings, possibly to gambling, and the mother slowly fell into religious fanaticism, possibly after losing another child. After the father left, there was no one left to protect Issac from his mother's religious delusions, and at the behest of who she thought was God, she took away his toys, his clothes, kept him isolated, and even tried to kill him with a knife, a sacrifice to God. Of course, it gets more complex from there, and as it turns out, the sacrificial stuff might not even be happening, but the point is, Issac is someone who has seen a lot of ugliness, and even comes to hate and fear himself as a result, seeing himself as the devil before, in some routes, locking himself in his toy chest to suffocate to death. Maybe this is his internalized cacophobia, and the eyes represent the eyes of God and his mother, scrutinizing him for any possible sin or fault, any ugliness, so to speak. It would explain why Venus, aside from one instance when she can turn into a bust of the goddess Venus, mainly has no feminine features. Honestly, she's shaped more like Issac than anything else. It certainly would explain why cacophobia is represented as eyes, something that is tied in with Issac's mother as a motif. Her items are often paired with her eyes, and her eyes appear in the womb, which is technically inside of her. It shows how symbolically she's always towering over Issac, watching him like a hawk, and has complete control over his life, and has the power to mentally and emotionally pull him apart and put him back together, just like any abusive parent. And since Issac is so young and so isolated, he has no choice but to accept what happens to him, only rebelling in his drawings and his imagination, escaping into the basement or the chest to what he sees as freedom, even if it isn't real or if it's all too real and deadly at that. Maybe this fight was never about Venus. It's about battling Issac's fears of himself and the damage that his mother has done to him. And that would explain the Rorschach test. And it explains why, in the end, Issac ends up in the Field of Flowers. It could represent his mental state, regardless of where he's at in life. It's tainted, but it's quiet and peaceful, even if it doesn't look it. It's the inner peace he's managed to obtain before continuing on his way to whatever ending awaits him. And since I'm a sucker for happy endings, and like to interpret the most recently added ending to the game as such, I like to think that after his dad rescued him from his mother, he's processing everything that happened in therapy. And if that's the interpretation, then it shows that no matter how bad or ugly the world may seem, we can fight through it to find peace in the strange and often cruel world. I'll see you guys in the next one.